Hello, I'm Nancy Bergman. I'm currently president of the Trempealeau County Historical Society, and today we're going to have a discussion about the Civil War, particularly about maybe Wisconsin's involvement in the Civil War. And we're fortunate today to have two guests come from La Crosse. I have Dave Geske, and I also have Ron Berg, who have come up here today. They're both Civil War buffs. They're very interested in it. And I'll ask them a little bit about themselves and give you a brief introduction. Dave may be known to more of you as the Mosquito Man in La Crosse. So Dave, why don't you tell us about what your job is in La Crosse, and then we'll ask Ron the same thing.
Oh, well, I work for the La Crosse County Health Department, and I'm the director of a vector-borne disease control program in La Crosse County. I'm also the president of the La Crosse City Council in La Crosse.
It keeps you pretty busy going to meetings then.
It keeps me busy going to things.
And Ron, where do you work?
I'm also employed with the La Crosse County Health Department, and I'm involved primarily with the hotel and restaurant inspection programs, private septic systems,
So you and
areas as such.
Dave are working in the same office, more or less.
Pretty
Okay.
much, yes.
Dave is a former resident of Trempealeau County. He went to school in Galesville. And I know he's collected things. He's had varied interest over the years. What were some of your early collections and things you were interested in?
Well, when I was young, my grandmother had talked to me a little bit about the family and the family involvement in the Civil War and her grandfather's involvement, and that's really what had gotten me interested. I started collecting photographs, paper photographs. I think a lot of us have seen the tintypes, but probably the most common photographs in the American Civil War were paper photographs. And when I was young, they were quite inexpensive to pick up, and you could find them often in antique stores and places. And so I started collecting those, and that really stimulated my interest in the American Civil War. It became kind of the photographs made it so personal. These photographs very often would have a name on them or a photographer's name on it, so you could get an idea of where they were from. And that's really what got me into, I think, it stimulated my interest in Civil War and got me into collecting Civil War era things.
But you also collected other military items, didn't you?
Well, a friend of my dad's had given me, was in the Second World War, and had given me some a German uniform that he brought back from they took off a little German officer, and that I've always been interested in history, and so that kind of promoted that military interest that I have.
But now it's basically the Civil War that you're interested in and actually collecting.
Well, that's right, and I think it really, I focus on Civil War, I think, just because I find it the most interesting, and because for my family, there's some personal history
connection,
and it's really intriguing. I think it's a fun time to be involved now too, because of all the reenactors and reenactments that are going on, and the anniversary of the American Civil War, 130th anniversary. That's been really a lot of fun. It's been fun to see these people who are reenactors who have such a focused and such good knowledge on the American Civil War, and I enjoy going to these things because you really end up learning an awful lot. I don't consider myself an expert, but I'm really interested, and many of these people are really become experts, and I encourage people, if they have an opportunity to go to a reenactment, that it's really a learning experience.
And do you think it's something that when you get into it, when you're studying the Civil War, that the more you study, the more you realize you don't know?
Well, that's really true, I think. And more written on the American Civil War than probably any period in American history. Where again, in my case, it's not that long ago that there weren't some family remembrances. I mean, I would talk to my grandmother about it, who remembered her grandfather who was in the war. And certainly a lot of prejudice, and I think you find that there were, certainly in the South, there's a number of people who are still being combative with the struggle. And so I think that exists. I think that it's interesting. And that was really stimulating for me.
Ron, how did you get interested in the Civil War?
I guess initially I didn't have a real big interest, but I had an interest in, one day Dave asked me to go along with him on one of his trips. Our families have never been real enthused about it, and when I bring up Civil War as an issue, my daughters will kind of look at me and say, well, it's Dad. But he talked me into accompanying with him down to a trip into Tennessee. And I went down and I took pictures of the Wisconsin monuments and tried to follow a little bit of what was going on, but there was so much information it was hard for me to absorb. And I came back, and a couple of months later I sat down with my pictures and I said, well, you know, I really should put something with these photographs so I can really have an idea of what I've seen. I started researching, and I was hooked. You know, I'm real involved, particularly in the winter. It's a real good winter project for me to.
Do you collect anything in particular?
Not a lot. I have a few little items in front of us here, such as the bullets, but my main interest is just following the Wisconsin troops, trying to go out to a battlefield and really kind of pick out where they walked, where they fought, where maybe some of them died, just trying to get a feel for the historic value of the action that took place.
Now, Dave and I both have ancestors that were in the Civil War. You have any ancestors that you know of?
I've looked, and it appears that all of my ancestors came over primarily after the Civil War from Norway.
But I think there are a lot of people in this county and in the state in general that maybe have ancestors they don't realize that were connected with the Civil War. We never realized we had any Civil War veterans in our family until just a few years ago when a cousin did a family history. And then we found we had somebody in there. And I had been interested in the Civil War since I was a young child, and that was very interesting to me. You talked about your, you were collecting the photographs, and I believe they're called carte de visites.
The paper photographs are called carte de visites.
Why don't you put one up, or you have some up there. Tell us a little about what they are.
Okay, we have, I brought a few of the photos along, and really the photos show individuals who served in the American Civil War who, paper photographs were becoming very popular. And this particular one shows a gentleman who was in the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry who was a physician. His name was William Bones.
Very appropriate.
Which was very appropriate. But really the paper photographs were used, it was new that you could have a negative, which meant you could make copies. The tintypes and other types of photographs that were available then, generally you couldn't copy. The carte de visites, or as they were called, CDVs, were really used not only as an opportunity to pass on your name or a keepsake from yourself to another individual. The Union and Confederate governments also used them to propagandize the war. Both the North and the South would have corps photographers who would go and take pictures of little soldiers out in their uniforms. Very often these would be sent home and would stimulate other people to maybe join the war effort. So there are many of this type photograph made. Probably the best and easiest collectible among the Civil War.
And how do you recognize a carte de visite then?
Well, again, it's a paper photograph. It's a smaller. Again, this is Dr. Bones.
So he actually had two different ones made, one of him standing and one of just his head?
Right, and I think when you look at Dr. Bones, this is an interesting photograph.
Big guy.
Yeah, big man. He is representing something in this photo. His authority, the sword, he's an officer. He has a sash, which if it were the color of the sash would have been green because he was a medical officer, but it indicates an officer. He has his little hat on the table and he has little cavalry cross swords, and I'm sure this was a picture he was real pleased with. Again, these were pretty inexpensive. You could, in some cases, through the corps photographers, you could get 20 for $1, 20 copies for $1. This was done by a private studio. It was probably more expensive. It was staged better, and it's a full length. This is a very collectible photo because it shows his equipment. And it's just a wonderful photo of the man.
Now, on the back of these cards, there was some, you said there were some marks on the back?
Right, and shown, I have some photos that will, very often, photos similar to this will have back marks. And what this does is really tells where the photo was taken. This CDV also has a revenue stamp on it.
Oh, that's not, it didn't go through the mail, that stamp there. It's
No, it was
something else.
it was something else. And really, what had happened was the federal government. A lot of things originated in the Civil War. Income tax, a number of taxes originated during the American Civil War, and this was an idea that someone had. They said, "Well, gosh, you know, these card to visits are so popular, and people are taking them and sending them home. Let's put a tax on it, and let's make some money off these card to visits." And really, what it happened was it significantly impacted the number of CDVs that were made or card to visits that were made. But the reason why they're so collectible, I think, for myself, they're so interesting because you do have the name of a photographer, so you know where the photo's taken. Very often, the people would sign the card to visits on the back, and we kept really good records of individuals in the American Civil War, and if you get information about where a person was from and their name, you can track them back and get their personal history. And to me, that was really interesting. I really like that.
Let's look at some of the other, can you show some of the other cards we have, some of the people? Are there any differences in the uniforms on these?
Well, there really are. And perhaps I should to show a different. This gentleman is from La Crosse, Wisconsin. It's Cat Walter Washburn, who was at this time a colonel in the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry. He went on to be governor of the state of Wisconsin. Was I believe a major general at the end of the war.
I believe so.
Yeah. And he also was a founder of General Foods. So he was a very good businessman. He had, there's an interesting letter to his brother that I had the opportunity to read where he had kind of lamented his being in the military. It was, I think, in 1863. He said there was such an opportunity to make money in this war. That as a good businessman, it was real hard for him to be in the military where he wasn't able to profit by the going on. As far as uniforms, I think it is interesting. We think about, there were many different types of uniforms, and in these photos too it represents. We had Dr. Bones in a very handsome uniform, medical uniform, and this next gentleman is again a Union officer, I think from Janesville, and he also his rank is captain or lieutenant. You can tell by the single row of buttons. He again has that officer sash and the sword. Again, sword for the majority of cases didn't represent a weapon that you're going to go in and hurt someone with, but a sign of authority.
It wasn't issued to the enlisted men then?
It was, non-commissioned officers would get a sword. Again, as a way to show rank.
Authority symbol.
Right.
Okay.
But no, the common soldier did not. Cavalrymen were issued sabers, and used them as part of their weaponry, and certainly hurt people with them. But in general, the majority of swords, and we have a representative piece over here, were not meant for that.
Sure. Look at it. Can you tell us about this sword? This is yours or Ron's?
This is mine. It's a non-commissioned officer sword, and it's really from La Crosse, Wisconsin, and it was made in 1864. And really, looking at it, it's not you wouldn't think of it as being a real weapon to hurt anyone. It was made to show that the individual who carried it was a sergeant, a non-commissioned officer, and that he had authority and rank. And that little sergeant who would carry this would not carry this into combat. He'd use it on parade and drill.
Ceremonial affairs.
Right.
Now, did the officers, did they have to buy their own swords?
Well, I believe
was there a government issue?
There are government issue swords. I think that the majority of officers, very often swords would be given to people who were elected. If you were, there were the La Crosse Light Guards, I believe, one in the 2nd Wisconsin, and someone was elected an officer. Very often a sword may be produced by proud locals for them. I think very often people did also purchase swords. This is a military issue sword.
Where did you get this one?
This one, it belonged to a family in La Crosse, and it was in an auction, and I was lucky enough to get it.
It's really beautiful. If you can see, this is what the hand part here is called. What, the hilt? Is that what they call the hilt of the sword? Anyway.
Well, this is a hilt, and it has a little protector, a little guard.
Probably can't see it too well on the camera, but it's got all kind of, I don't know, some kind of a carving, or it's really textured. It's really a special thing. I have seen some really ornate swords that were carried by higher officers. That's why I was wondering if they were able to go out and get their own fancy sword if they had the money.
Oh, and they certainly could. There were swords that were mass-produced too for officers. There were staff and field officer swords, and they were produced in certain years. I have at home have an 1862 staff and field officer sword, which again is a very small, narrow-bladed sword that's designed to show rank.
Were they ever actually taught to use these swords? I mean, did they have any kind of fencing or drills?
Yeah, I think the cavalrymen probably had techniques that they were shown.
They probably had to learn how to get on the horse with the sword.
That would be, yeah, that would be important. And I think that, as the Civil War progressed, the importance of small revolvers and firearms began very important. You have to remember, too, with cavalry that it wasn't only, very often they became mounted infantry. They would go from point to point, dismount, and use their rifles to defend an area. They weren't always horse to horse, and there certainly were some bloody battles where they used sabers, but for the most part in that war, swords were not really a weapon of war, but a mark of authority.
And I believe the South really had it over the North as far as the cavalry there for a while, didn't they?
Well,
being more effective, or more effective use of their cavalry.
Well, I think so. The South had some really very good cavalry leaders. I think that there certainly is, again, depending on who you talk to. I remember being at the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond and hearing the people there talk about Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart's nickname was Beautiful. At West Point, they
he was quite a dandy, wasn't he?
He was, but really it was, he wasn't beautiful. He had a very small chin. And in the Civil War, he grew a beard to cover that. At West Point, he could not have the beard, and was not a real attractive man. And that's why they nicknamed him Beautiful. But at the Museum of the Confederacy, you get kind of a different twist on that story, that he was this gallant cavalier who, but very capable man, young man, who did some things that cost the South tremendously, and particularly at the Battle of Gettysburg, where he went off on this kind of glitzy ride around the Union Army and failed to provide information to General Lee, which many scholars believe cost the South the Battle of Gettysburg. So cavalry, when it was used well as a mechanism to see where the enemy was and gather information, when it was used that way, it could be used very effectively. During Civil War, there was one group, a Pennsylvania group, that carried lances. I think Russia's lancers. Lancers were very commonly used in Europe up to the First World War. But here, I mean, this was modern warfare, and it was evolving here, and so that one group of lancers lost their lances pretty rapidly and traded them in for carbines, for short rifles.
Are there any other different uniforms on these carte de vistas we have over here? We've seen the surgeon and the cavalry, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's an enlisted man on the lower left here who is wearing a 4-button sack coat, and it was probably a pretty common type uniform.
What were they made out of? What kind of material?
Well, very often wool, and I guess depending on, in the South they had cotton, but cotton, if you were going through areas with bushes and things, it would be, it was real hard to keep the uniform together. Wool was used commonly. It always amazes me to see these reenactors out in these heavy uniforms. I had the opportunity to go to the battle, or the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg a few years ago, and it was in July and very warm. And these, I think on one day it went above 100 degrees, and these little reenactors out there running around wearing these wool uniforms. And, but they're very heavy uniforms. They were also issued, enlisted men, initially the uniforms were frock coats, longer jackets for infantry. many, I think 9 buttons they had on them. The style in the uniform here is a 4-button one. It's a little bit later. It's a little simpler to get in and out of, and simpler made.
Now, who is this man, do you know?
No, I don't know who this man is, but he has an interesting uniform too. He has an earlier, this is a frock coat. It's high collar and the buttons. Probably...
it almost looks like a band uniform.
Yeah, it's commonly with band uniforms, they would have some striping across the chest, and the uniform that's kind of behind us, when talk a little bit more about that later, represents what a band uniform might look like.
Well, we can talk about that
this.
right now. This is yours?
This is mine. We don't know much about the history of this. It's a gray, cadet gray uniform. It's a shell jacket, and that's another style of uniform that was very often used by the cavalry and the artillery. The interesting thing about this is that it's in very rough shape, but band members very often would have this type of striping across the uniform. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this fellow was in a band. We talked a little bit before about the different uniforms that when people entered the war, many different uniforms, particularly in militia. This was probably a militia jacket.
Oh, is this a Confederate uniform? It's gray.
Well, the first Wisconsin troops that left to go off and fight in the Civil War also wore gray. Gray was a real popular color, and it was very stylish. And the Wisconsin State Militia had these new gray uniforms. They were very, very well made, really very, very stylish. When they went to the First Battle of Bull Run, it got them in trouble because there were other gray uniforms on the field that, representing Southern troops. Same thing happened with some Southern regiments. I think there were certain Louisiana groups that had blue uniforms. They were really a mixture. There was a Highland division from New York that wore kilts and traded their kilts in for platted pants. And then as the war went on, most of the militia would trade their uniform in for standard U.S. issue. The cuffing on this may indicate that it's from Georgia.
Where did you get this?
Well, it's an old family thing. I'm not sure where it came from, or
maybe something they brought back as a souvenir,
or something someone found. Yeah.
We have another couple pieces of uniform back here. Now let's see. Is this your hat, Dave, or does this belong to Ron?
Well, this is
It's
basically everything is Dave's collection.
Okay.
This is a Civil War kepi, and this again was a stylish. It's an officer's hat. It was a French style that became very popular. This gentleman who had this was in the 2nd Minnesota, and he was a staff and field officer, and on the front there's a U.S., so he was a staff member.
It's a small hat, isn't it?
It's a small hat. The uniform is very small also. And these were smaller people.
That's right.
But that is one of the styles that was worn. When my great-grandfather left La Crosse, he probably was wearing a slouch hat, a larger rounded brimmed hat. Many of the Western troops wore those. The kepis and bummer caps, which are extended version of this, are really the ones that many of the Eastern troops wore, and I think a lot of people have in mind when they think of the Civil War.
And this is a sash?
This is a sash, and if you remember in the photographs we showed earlier, they had the sash around their waist, and this green sash is really for a physician. Different colors would represent different type of enactment. The green was for medical in sashes. Generally, blue would represent infantry. But for sashes, infantry officers would wear red. For the different types of categories, infantry would be blue, artillery red, and cavalry yellow. And very often in the piping on their uniforms, or if there are officers in their rank collar on the inside, that would be the color that would be there. For the sashes, it would be red for all officers except general officers, who wore gold, and medical officers wore green.
And this was mainly just a dress-up. It didn't hold their pants up or anything.
No, it was a dress-up. It was stylish.
It wasn't something they wore every day then
No,
either?
no.
Okay. Also on the table here, we have a few pieces of, I guess you call ordnance?
Basically, they're different types of shells that were used by actually both armies. This is an example of grape shot. These were put into a metal canister and inserted in the artillery pieces, usually used at close range. And you'd have this metal can with a wood block behind it with the powder charge behind that. When the powder ignited, these balls, and there might be 15, 20, 30, 40, or 50, 60 of them, depending on the size, would come out the front of the canyon and just cause incredible devastation, especially at near range.
And these other smaller?
This is an example of what was called a mini ball. And I'm not sure why they called it that, but they were basically lead. They're very destructive. If one of these were to hit a bone, it would generally shatter it into so many pieces that the arm had to be amputated, or the leg, or wherever it happened to hit. It would cause just incredible devastation.
I think it was the inventor's name was Mini. It was. I think he was a French physician. I think.
Oh, great.
His name was Mini.
This was probably the most common bullet used in the war. There are some examples of musket balls here as well that weren't nearly as accurate. With the mini ball as well, they could be used in rifled barrels, so they were accurate to for a very long range in many cases.
Now this one that has the kind of a flattened head, you said this apparently had gone in, had hit something.
I suspect probably a tree or a stone or some other object.
Mm-hmm. They're really very heavy.
Many of these things are found at battlefields. I've picked these up from collector shops near the battle
Have you ever
sites.
found any actually on a battlefield?
The battlefields themselves, all the artifacts there are protected by law,
You're not supposed to
and we're
carry
not
them
supposed to
off.
look, and we haven't.
Now these are all made from lead.
This, I
Right.
think, is probably an iron, possibly.
And
It's a little different. It does rust, and it's a little heavier, a little more solid.
we had the important, kind of interesting fact that you said a lot of the lead that actually went into the ordnance was mined in Wisconsin.
Well, I think, besides the number of young men, I think we talked about there being about 155,000 young men between the ages of 18 and 55 in Wisconsin during the Civil War, and about 91,000 of those went to fight in the American Civil War. And
Which is more than half.
more than half. But the other important things coming from Wisconsin, one was food, the cropland, but the other was lead, and about 17 million pounds of lead left Wisconsin during the war to be used for bullets and other.
And that came mainly from Mineral Point, I would suppose, and across the border in Galena.
I would guess in that area.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you put the rifle up here too, and we'll look
Okay.
at that too.
One other comment on the shells. When you think of a normal battle, in some cases there may have been 150,000 troops on both sides. A good soldier could load a rifle like this probably twice a minute. When a battle lasts for 3 or 4 hours, you're talking just literally millions of shells like this that were used.
Now, whose rifle is this?
This is my rifle. This is a 1863 Enfield rifle. It's an imported rifle
British,
from
isn't
Britain. It's probably the second most common rifle used in the American Civil War, the most common being the Springfield rifles. But as Ron's bullets kind of indicate, there's round shot, there's mini balls, a lot of different weapons were used. This weapon was really a pretty standard issue weapon for Union and some Confederate troops. A lot of rifles were imported for the war, and the Enfield was one of the best.
Now, is this a rifle? Is the barrel actually rifled?
Yeah, this is a rifle.
Okay. Now, but a lot of the early ones weren't rifled. Is that correct? And they were very inaccurate.
Right, and that's where Ron has the round shot from.
I think an interesting fact at Shiloh, when Sherman's unit there had 6 different types of ammunition that were needed for their soldiers. And it became a real nightmare when you had to get resupplied, and if you couldn't get the right ammunition, it was a real problem.
And these, of course, were not repeating rifles.
No, this is single shot. Like Ron said, if you had someone who was very good, they might get off, 2 to 3 shots per minute.
Can you describe what they actually had to do to load this thing and make it shoot?
Yeah, again, I think with this, what they would need to do is put the paper in. They'd need to ram that in and ram the shot in, and then need to put the cap on, percussion cap.
And where did they carry those?
They generally a pouch, pouches that they would carry on their belt.
What did the cap look like?
It's little like a little piece of brass.
Oh, okay.
And then you would have to take, I assume they really took their time and to fire because it took a while to load. But, and that's interesting. I think Ron had mentioned before a little bit about early in the war, there were some ideas about purchasing Spencer repeating rifles. And the ordnance people were real reluctant to buy them because they said, look, if we allow these guys to fire 6 or 7 times, they're not going to take their time to aim, and they're going to use more ammunition. It'll cost us more money. They kind of forgot that it also made 100 men seem like several hundred men. There were some independent regiments. One, I think in particular, was the 72nd in Illinois at Missionary Ridge and some places who had privately bought repeating rifles. And really what it did was it made their opportunities to live a little bit better.
I would think that would be a good investment.
So, a good investment.
These would get quite dangerous at times when they got real hot up here in the barrel. When you jam that powder down with the rod, the powder might prematurely discharge and shoot the rod out. It was very easy to lose a finger or other part. I think you described maybe once where you normally use the small finger.
I remember reading that, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Why, that meaning that was the finger you could have best afford to lose?
I think that's right. Yeah. Well, I think that's why too with reenactors, a lot of times you see them capping the rifles with something before they fire it, and that's because they don't want to. They want to make sure they don't leave the ramrod in, because all of a sudden a reenactment becomes quite dangerous if there are these ramrods flying around.
Oh my goodness.
So.
It's hard for me to picture somebody in the midst of battle having to stop and go through this whole process to load this gun before you can fire it
Before
again.
you can fire again. I think it gave the enemy a lot of times a real opportunity to advance on a position while you were trying to reload your rifle.
It must have been a real scary thing.
You know, it really did play a part in strategy too, because things were really changing, and I think the old school of how you know, using the bayonet and charging with the bayonet, and the ability to kill an enemy who was 300 yards away, and to shoot and quite accurately hurt someone, that was a real change. And I think that there were generals who really, it took a lot of time for them to learn that this was more modern warfare, and it cost the lives of a lot of young men.
I think I'd like to go on now and discuss a little more about Wisconsin's role in the Civil War. We had 3 real prominent heroes from Wisconsin from the Civil War. One that most people are probably the most familiar with is Colonel Hans Christian Haig. If we want to slide his picture over there, maybe Ron could tell us a little bit about Colonel Haig.
He's a very interesting individual. He came over from Norway when he was 11 with his family. His father was quite influential in the Norwegian community, I think by Muskego, Wisconsin. And many of the settlers that came after them would stay in Haig's barn and basically become acclimated to the country before they moved on to other settlements. I believe when he was 18, I think in 1949, he had decided he would like to venture out to California and try the gold rush for a couple of years. He went out with 4 friends with teams of oxen, so you know it wasn't a fast trip.
He actually crossed the country rather than taking the boat.
Yes. He had, I think he started out with 2 yoke of oxen, which is approximately 4 oxen. And they purchased more in Missouri from settlers that had decided this wasn't the trip they wanted to make.
Did he find gold?
He did find some gold. One of the few letters that were found from his expedition indicated that at one time he had about $1,000 in his pocket after expenses.
So he was the colonel of what, you said the 15th Wisconsin, which was mainly a Norwegian regiment?
It was primarily a Norwegian regiment made up of units from Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin. He was a very well-known man. He had been elected the commissioner of prisons for the state of Wisconsin and lived in Waupun for a couple of years before he put together his regiment. He went in as a colonel with, I believe it was Governor Randall at the time, but I'm not completely sure.
And you said there were how many Oles in the 15th?
There were 128 Oles in the 15th. I think one regiment had like 8 or 10 Ole Olsons.
Oh my goodness.
And it was a real problem.
I have a 1867 copy of a history of the 15th Wisconsin at home. My one problem with it is it's written in Norwegian.
There were some men from this county that were in the 15th. I don't have their names, so I remember one was a Larson. And there is some dispute over whether we have the little community down between Ettrick and Blair that's called Haig, whether that was actually named after Colonel Haig or if it was just there are families in this area by that name too. But I have a feeling that since it was established around the 1860s, it might have been named after Colonel Haig. And if you go down to Madison now, his statue is on the square, isn't it?
His statue is on the square, that's correct. It's, I believe it's on the southeast corner. It's actually it's the only statue on the square that's a Civil War veteran. He was
killed at Chickamauga, wasn't he?
He was killed at Chickamauga during a real intense battle, and it was a real frustrating situation. The troops, Wisconsin 15th, he was a brigade commander at that time, and his brigade and Carlin's brigade were basically in front of the Union line, out extended several hundred yards. When the Confederates attacked from the front, they also came in from the sides and attacked his flanks, and there was a heavy loss of life. And they described the battle afterwards. Normally, reporters could go onto the battle site after a battle and they could kind of determine the flow of the battle by the bullet holes in the trees. But where the Norwegian troops were in the 15th, there were bullet holes from all sides. It was a real heavy action.
And he was shot, and then there was some dispute over when he died. We were looking at...
Yes, I've read two different statements. The one that he died that evening. He was shot in the bowels, which is a slow, lingering death.
And that was certain death, too, wasn't it?
It was certain death. There was really nothing they could do. And then the other account described him surviving until the following noon, when some of the troops had a chance to come back and see him and say goodbye before he died.
And there's also some dispute about that maybe he was kind of set up.
That's an opinion of mine. Earlier in the war, shortly after Stones River at Murfreesboro, he was under the command of a Union general named by the name of Jefferson Davis.
But not the President of the Confederacy.
Not the President of the Confederacy.
Must have been confusing.
This man was not a very nice man. Earlier in the war, he had shot his unarmed commander, but no charges were ever brought because it was during wartime and they were unable to convene a court-martial for him. Haig and Carlin, his two brigade commanders, went to Rosecrans, which was the commanding general of the Army at that time, at Stones River, and asked to have Davis removed. Davis, being the vindictive man that he was, I feel may have ordered Carlin and Haig to extend past the normal Union line at Chickamauga just to expose them to heavy fire.
And now one of these pictures is a monument to Colonel Haig.
Yes, this photograph here is a pyramid of cannonballs
over there,
showing the site where he was shot. What they've done, each time a brigade commander is killed at a battle site, they will mark the spot with a pyramid like that made of cannonballs.
This is at Chickamauga in Tennessee,
Chickamauga, yes.
right? Let's put this down on the table too.
Okay.
And then I guess another hero that maybe most people aren't aware was from Wisconsin was he a general, Arthur MacArthur, who was the father of Douglas MacArthur,
the
Civil War, or not Civil War, but Second World War fame.
Real confusing. His name was Arthur MacArthur. He was Arthur MacArthur Jr. His father was a judge in Milwaukee, and he was real anxious to serve in the war. His father tried to get him to point with West Point, but President Lincoln said that there wouldn't be any openings for a couple of years, so he joined the 24th Wisconsin as a first lieutenant.
And what was his real heroic act that really brought him a lot of fame?
Well, he had a couple of them, but I think his main act was at the Battle of Chattanooga at Missionary Ridge. And what he did there is Grant had ordered all the troops to attack the rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. And after the troops took those pits, they were still getting fired upon by the Confederates up on top, and MacArthur and some of the other men. One thing I should point out with the Civil War is that the battle flag was more important than life itself. And the men seemed to be willing to die at any cost to save their flag. The flag bearers of the 24th decided to keep right on going up the hill. MacArthur and the 24th followed. The first flag bearer was shot, the second was bayoneted, and the third flag bearer was decapitated by a cannonball. MacArthur picked up the flag, continued up to the top of the hill, and planted it at the crest near the Confederate commander's headquarters. General Sheridan watched all this and said, "Take care of this boy, he's going to win Medal of Honor." With that, he was promoted to major. He was again wounded twice at Kennesaw Mountain. In one of the shots, he took was in the chest, but because he had his Bible and a package of letters, it stopped the shell. And within a week, he was back on duty again. I think one of my favorite stories occurred a few months later at Franklin. He had served as part of the rear guard on their return to Franklin from Spring Hills. And as the Confederates attack, they break through the center of the Union line near the place called the Carter House. Well, MacArthur and his troops are resting in front of the Carter House trying to get a little coffee and something to eat after having fought most of the way back from Spring Hills. When the Confederates broke through it, it turned into hand-to-hand combat. And MacArthur jumped up, realizing the situation, ordered his troops to move forward. He leaped on his horse. In this case, he pulled out his saber. This is at the action. You got to picture this now as this smoky scene with the gunfire, and it's just about dusk and it's dark. And as the story goes, he's slashing with his saber on his horse towards the Confederate flag. Now he's shot from his horse and wounded. He gets up and continues to fight towards this Confederate flag, which is now held by a Confederate major. The major sees MacArthur, points his revolver towards him, shoots him again. MacArthur runs his saber through the major, killing him. As the major is collapsing, he supposedly shoots him again in the legs. That was the end of... MacArthur survived, as you're well aware. And that was the end of his Civil War battles, but he went on to be
quite a career after that, didn't he?
A famous general.
And I think he was, at one point, he was the governor of the Philippines, wasn't he, after the Spanish-American War?
He was the military governor of the Philippines, and I don't remember the president at that time, but he sent a gentleman named Taft, who would later be president, over as a civilian governor. And MacArthur and Taft did not get along. A short time later, Taft was named Secretary of Defense. MacArthur was recalled and restationed at Milwaukee at his home with no duties. He basically stayed there for about 2 years, and when Taft was elected president, MacArthur realized his career was over because he was really hoping to be appointed chief of staff. He retired.
Well, it was quite a long career in that family. Another hero I guess we should mention is, what was
Joseph Bailey.
General, okay, General Joseph Bailey. I'll put this picture up there. This is a picture of his famous dam. Maybe you can tell us something about.
He was an engineer with a logging company out of Wisconsin Dells, and his primary purpose there was to build dams to help float the logs downstream. He entered the war in the 4th Wisconsin Regiment, which initially was an infantry unit. Later in the war, he was serving as an engineer under General Banks on the ill-fated Red River expedition.
And that was in Arkansas?
In Louisiana.
Louisiana.
On what had happened, the Union fleet was brought up, which was worth at that time about $2 million.
And you said they were ironclads.
They were mostly ironclads, yes. They were used in support of the Army in their field operations.
Were they a real shallow draft?
They were fairly heavy. When you look at a picture of an ironclad, the upper body is primarily all covered with iron. And they were, I don't know what...
They had a shallow draft, like river boats, but because they were heavier, they needed a little bit more clearance.
So they needed a fairly deep channel to maneuver
navigate.
in.
Supposedly at that time of the year, the water should have been up, but the Admiral Porter, who was in charge of the fleet, realized that the water was dropping rapidly and he needed to get out of there. When he got back down to Alexandria, where the rapids were, they were unable to go over the top of the rapids because of the low water, and they were considering burning the fleet. At that point, they decided there was no way they were going to get over these rapids, and they better destroy them before they fell into Confederate hands. Bailey came out and said, look, I can build a dam, we can raise the river, and we can save these ships. The river's 600 feet across, and there were some other engineers there from West Point who thought, this is just folly, there's just no way anybody could do this in maybe less than a year. He was able to convince Admiral Porter that maybe this would work. He was given 3,000 men, several hundred wagons, and he put the men to work night and day. And within 8 days, he had completed a dam that looked like it was going to work. Just about the time it was complete and the water was coming up, because of the water pressure, the dam broke, and only 4 of the ironclads were able to escape.
But he was he an engineer?
He was an
by
engineer.
trade. But he was also in the lumber business, and it was his familiarity with floating the logs down the rivers that helped him construct this dam.
Within 3 more days, he was able to construct additional wing dams upstream and continued to raise the water, and he saved the entire fleet.
And then he went on to a career where he became eventually a general. He wasn't a general when
He was breveted a general after that engagement. He was also honored by Congress. He was only one of 14 members of the Union Army that was honored by Congress for special acknowledgement.
What were some of the other regiments in Wisconsin? We mentioned the Norwegian Regiment, the 15th. What were some of the other ones?
You could talk about the 14th.
Well, yeah, I had a great-great-grandfather in the 14th Wisconsin.
Why don't you tell us about it? It was kind of an interesting story.
Well, he had, he was from La Crosse County, and he had been in the 14th Wisconsin. The 14th Wisconsin was in the Western Theater of the War. They were at the Battle of Shiloh and at Vicksburg, and later on would be at the Battle of Nashville, and were on the Red River Expedition. But my great-grandfather was back on furlough in 1863 and was caught in a snowstorm. And he and quite a number of the men from that regiment who were trying to get back to Camp Brandel in Madison were caught in a snowstorm. So they were to meet the 14th later on, I believe in St. Louis. And St. Louis or Vicksburg. But anyway, they were going back. The 14th Wisconsin went on the Red River Expedition. At the same time, General Sherman was getting troops up for his push to Atlanta, and my great-great-grandfather and a number of other young men were kind of taken along with him for the ride. So this gentleman went to Atlanta and fought in the battles around Atlanta. After that, came back and served and fought at the Battle of Nashville. I have another great-great-grandfather who was with MacArthur in the 24th Wisconsin.
That was mainly down by Milwaukee, the eastern part of the state?
Well, he was from Janesville. But he had, it was interesting, he had been in the 34th Wisconsin. And the 34th Wisconsin were a group of men who were kind of put on garrison duty at different places. And in 1863, the enlistment of all their officers ran out, and the officers went home. And the little enlisted men were kind of left in camp to do whatever they wanted. And the majority of them wanted to go home, and did. And finally, I think on January 1st of 1864, they were all gone. My great-great-grandfather chose to join the 24th Wisconsin after that, and was at the Battle of Franklin that Ron had talked about with MacArthur. And a short time after that, his enlistment was up, and being a wise Wisconsin boy, decided to go home, and did go home.
I had a great-great-uncle who had enlisted with a Missouri outfit. The recruiter had come up the river to La Crosse. His name was Lieutenant James Otis, and he was recruiting for Fremont, James Fremont's outfit in Missouri. I can't remember the title of the regiment and everything, but it was supposed to be a sharpshooter unit. And he enlisted in 1861 and went down to Missouri and went through Shiloh and several battles. And then a few years ago, when we were compiling a family history, we found on his Civil War record that he had deserted. And I think what happened was apparently his enlistment had run out, and the regiment at that time, they realized the war wasn't going to be over in a couple of months, and they wanted everybody to just kind of stay on and re-enlist. And I think he just went home, because a few years after the Civil War, he tried to get a pension, and he apparently felt that he had good reason to have a pension, although he was refused. But he didn't have a real glorious war record. There was another man that was connected with Gale College, a Methodist chaplain. Maybe we can get his picture up there. His name was Samuel Fallows. He wasn't from this county, but he was, I believe, he and his wife were one of the first teachers at Gale College before the war. He was a Methodist, and when the war started, he wasn't teaching anymore. He and his wife had gone back to the eastern part of the state. Our Historical Society has letters where he is writing to George Gale, his employer, asking for money that George owed him because he wants to buy his uniform. He's going in as a chaplain. And he did serve as a chaplain. And the interesting thing was that he rose, I think it was, to a position of leadership. I believe he became a general. And even though his outfit really didn't get into any big battles, they had the only regiment with the distinction of being led by a Methodist chaplain. But he was connected with our county for a while. And Dave and I were also saying that the drummer boy of Shiloh, whose name was John Clem, was at Gale College for a while after the war. I can't remember if he was in a position of an administrator or why he was there, but he was connected with the college for a while here in Trempealeau County.
I think people my age probably remember Walt Disney did a movie called The Drummer
Right.
Boy of Shiloh, I think, and he, or Chickamauga, he was at both, I think, but that was Johnny Clem.
Now, you and Ron have both gone to several different battlefields. What are some of the ones you've gone to?
I guess basically we've been to most of the battlefields on what's considered to be the Western Front, which is Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi. We've been to Shiloh, I think, is probably my favorite. It's very well maintained. There's just a lot of things to see there. All the battle sites are well marked. There's markers describing the first day's action, the second day's. There's markers describing actions of various Wisconsin units there and what part they took place and what time the action
This is
occurred.
some literature you've brought on Vicksburg, I believe. Isn't it?
Mhm.
That Vicksburg, this is one you've also gone to?
We had the distinction
Put
of
that picture up there. It's of the
Cairo?
ironclad. Mm-hmm.
we traveled to Vicksburg on a day that would normally, on a day that the average high is 70 degrees, and we had the distinction of being there when the wind chill was like 6 below. But
It never did warm up.
didn't warm up, no. But the, I think in the credits earlier in the program, there was a picture of a infantryman, and that's from the memorial at Vicksburg.
And there were Wisconsin troops there.
There were many Wisconsin troops there.
What, you said 9,000 or more?
I believe so,
Yeah,
yes.
and that's where, if people have heard of Old Abe, the War Eagle
Oh,
from the 8th
right,
Wisconsin, he was, the 8th Wisconsin was at Vicksburg, and many Wisconsin troops at Vicksburg. But that monument, the Wisconsin monument at Vicksburg at the top is Old Abe, and again, the statue at in the credits in the beginning is one from that memorial.
Now, Old Abe was an eagle, right?
He was an eagle.
And
a
he
bald
was
eagle.
kept as the mascot. And
Yes,
they
he
what? They had him on a tether, or how'd they haul him around?
Well, he was allowed to fly.
I believe during battles, the rumor was, or the description was, that he would fly over the Confederate troops screaming at them.
And how come they never
And
shot him down?
That's a good question. I think there were many attempts to do so. But
I think they said too, though, he didn't like cannon fire, and when the loud explosion, he'd go very high, and he had the ability to fly higher than most birds.
it's
Probably.
surprising he came back.
It is surprising he came back.
And after the war, after he died, he was stuffed and kept in the Capitol in Madison.
Yep.
And then he was destroyed in a fire, I believe.
He was.
So there is no more Old Abe.
It's interesting, though, when we go to different sites, people have stuffed eagles on display, and it'll say Old Abe.
He was pretty famous.
There's one at
then.
Camp Douglas over here, 50 miles from us, on the interstate.
I guess one other thing you were mentioning about Wisconsin too, that you've heard of Camp Randall Stadium down in Madison, and it served two different functions, didn't it? It was a training camp?
And point of embarking troops, I think, and then as prisoner of war camp. And I think still the cannon and some of the prisoner pens are still on display near the basketball arena.
In our county, if you look at some of the names of the towns around here, I think they reflect that they were formed during the Civil War era. Like, well, we're in the town of Lincoln here at Whitehall, and Independence is in the town of Burnside, and he was a general for the Union. Commanded the Union armies for a while, didn't he?
He was, and wore the
Sideburns.
sideburns.
Or Burnsides, that he was famous for. Near Osceola, we have the town of Sumner, and he was also a political figure, wasn't he?
Well, Sumner was, yeah, he was a Secretary of War or Secretary of State. I was
I'm not sure.
confused, but yeah, Sumner.
A major politician. And one time, in between Osceola and Oliva, there had been the town of Chase, who had been formed by a settler called Chase. Mr. Chase went off to the Civil War, was killed, and never came back. And so the town of Chase kind of disappeared, and it became, I think, I'm not sure what it is now, if it's Albion or he never came back anyway.
And they changed the name on him. That doesn't seem very nice.
And there were quite a few men from this county that went, I believe. I think in 1860s there probably weren't too many settlers here anyway. It wasn't overly populated.
Well, I think that, really you think about the state of Wisconsin, and Wisconsin certainly had many more people than Minnesota or Iowa, but we were a western state, and I think that there was a lot of debate whether we should be sending troops in the first place. I know in La Crosse there was a newspaper editor of the La Crosse Democrat named Pomeroy who was outspoken.
He was famous being a Copperhead, wasn't he? That meant he was kind of for the South?
Well, he wasn't for the South, he was against the war. And I think where he was coming from was that, look, if we're truly a free people, we should have the freedom to decide to leave the federal government. But he went on to make statements not only condemning the war in the North, but advocating the assassination of Lincoln. So he was in some areas popular, but in most part not very popular at all.
I think there was one interesting point about the governor of Wisconsin, Governor Harvey, served after Governor Randall decided not to run for re-election. After the Battle of Shiloh, he organized a relief mission to go down to Shiloh to bring down medical aid and food supplies and things, blankets, for the troops. On the way home, he fell from his freighter in the process of making a transfer and drowned. His body was recovered about 65 miles later by some southern children who had their slave pull the body in where they robbed it of valuables and pushed it back into the river again. And he was later returned to Wisconsin, but he only served for maybe 100 days. It was a real tragedy.
Well, I think this has been a pretty interesting program today, and we've really just kind of skimmed over a lot of things. Maybe we can get together and do this again sometime. I want to encourage everybody that's watching this, if you do have a history or an interest in history, that we'd be more than happy to have you join us at the Trempealeau County Historical Society. If you're interested in contacting us about membership, you can call Pat Creasel, and her telephone number will be showing on the screen. Right now we're kind of exciting because we're hoping we can work with the directors of Marynook and Galesville. We're going to get a room there hopefully where we can put some of our books and things that we've been collecting. We'd like to see the old main building there in Marynook preserved and taken care of. It's a real piece it was a college in the wilderness. It was pretty unique. And also Arcadia is starting their own branch, or has started their own branch of the Historical Society. I mean, if you're close to Arcadia, you could call Clarence Crum over there. He's one of the people that's organized it. I'd like to see the people on the northern end of the county, Oliva and Osseo and Strum, maybe they'd start their own branch. This long, narrow county, it would be nice to have several different historical societies. I think we'd get better representation that way. But thank you, Dave and Ron, for coming down today and bringing all your artifacts and pictures, and we'll try to do it again. I think it would be real interesting. I have a list at home. I should have brought it. It was a partial list of actual veterans of the Civil War that were from Trempealeau County. And if you're ever cruising around the county, some of these older cemeteries, you will find their Civil War veterans buried there, and usually they have some kind of a marker by the side of the grave that denotes that they were in the Civil War. So I guess in closing, I want to say thanks for coming up here, and we hope we do this again soon. Okay.